The committee will come to order. Mr. Blount, welcome to the committee, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion on the harmful cyber attack against your company, Colonial Pipeline, and how we can work together to strengthen our coordination and response to these very serious cybersecurity incident. When Colonial Pipeline was forced to shut down operations last month due to a ransomware attack, millions of Americans up and down the East Coast had their lives disrupted by gas shortages and price increases. In the weeks since your company was struck, we have seen a series of other attacks on everything from our transportation networks to meatpacking centers. Just today, we learned of additional intrusions into internet platforms. Those private sector strikes follow especially damaging attacks on our federal government, including the extensive SolarWinds hack earlier this year. While the objectives of these attacks differ, they all demonstrate that bad actors, whether criminal organizations or foreign governments, are always looking to exploit the weakest link, infiltrate networks, steal information, and disrupt American life. Mr. Blount, I'm glad your company continues to recover from this malicious attack and that the FBI was able to recover millions of dollars in ransom paid. But I am alarmed that this breach ever occurred in the first place and that communities from Texas to New York suffered as a result. I appreciate that you have joined us today to provide answers to the committee and the American people on how a group of criminals was able to infiltrate your networks, steal nearly 100 gigabytes of data in just 2 hours, and then lock your systems with ransomware to demand payment. I'm also looking forward to hearing an update on your progress to recover from this serious breach. Private entities, especially those that are critical to our nation's infrastructure, are responsible for assessing their individual risk and investing in the technology to prevent breaches and to ensure that they can continue to provide service to customers who rely on them for basic necessities like fuel. At the same time, the federal government must develop a comprehensive, all-of-government approach to not only defend against cyber attacks, but punish foreign adversaries who continue to perpetrate them or harbor criminal organizations that target American systems. This approach requires bolstering our defenses and using the full might of our diplomatic, military, and intelligence capabilities. We must also ensure private entities like Colonial are providing the federal government with timely and relevant information in the event of a major incident. We need federal agencies charged with cybersecurity like the Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to understand the extent of these attacks and how best to support victims. Make no mistake, if we do not step up our cybersecurity readiness, the consequences will be severe. The ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline affected millions of Americans. The next time an incident like this happens, unfortunately, it could be even worse. As chairman of this committee, I'm committed to prioritizing policies that will help secure our critical infrastructure networks, including in the proposed infrastructure package Congress is now negotiating. Protecting the American people from these sophisticated, harmful, and growing attacks will not be easy. We must learn from our past mistakes, find out what went wrong, and work together to tackle this enormous challenge. Inaction, however, is simply not an option. With that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Blount, thank you for being here today. We're going to get into some tough questioning, and unfortunately, what happened to your company is not an isolated incident. We've had some good bipartisan work over the years to improve cybersecurity on this committee with you, Senator Peters, with you, Senator Johnson, and others. And yet, let's face it, there's a lot more to do. And what happened with regard to Colonial Pipeline is one example. This is about ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure. And that's the topic of the hearing broadly today. This paralyzes a company by locking its computer systems, holding its data and operations hostage until ransom is paid. Interestingly, these ransoms are not just on the company itself typically. Increasingly, the hackers also pursue a two-pronged ransom approach where they download and threaten to release sensitive victim data. So individuals, say your customers, may also have been subject to ransomware. There seems to be a new ransomware attack every week. We're going to hear today again about Colonial Pipeline and some of the details there. But no entity, public or private, is safe from these attacks. Last week, we learned that ransomware shut down the world's largest meat processor, JBS, including 9 beef plants in the United States. Both the Colonial Pipeline attack and JBS attacks were attributed to a Russian criminal organization, by the way. Just this morning, news broke that a constituent outreach services platform that nearly 60 offices in the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, uses was hit with a ransomware attack. As I've said before, no one is safe from these attacks, including us. I hope that we'll cover 4 specific areas here today. One is we've got to understand that these attacks have real-world consequences. On May 7th, Colonial Pipeline learned they suffered a ransomware attack impacting their information technology or IT systems by this Russian-based criminal group called DarkSide. Recent news reports indicate that hackers accessed Colonial system through a compromised password of a virtual private network account. This account did not use multi-factor authentication, which is a very basic cybersecurity best practice. We'll talk more about that, why they didn't. And this easily allowed the hackers to gain access. Colonial moved quickly to disconnect their operational system to prevent hackers from moving laterally and accessing those systems. That, of course, although an appropriate response to a cyber attack, made Colonial's critical pipelines unusable. And that was a huge problem. So real-world consequences. 45% of the East Coast fuel was coming from Colonial. With operations shut down, people across the East Coast bought fuel in a panic, unsure how long the shortage would last. A lot of service stations ran out of fuel altogether. So people couldn't get gas, couldn't get to work. And, of course, prices skyrocketed. Again, real-world consequences. Second, I hope today we'll talk about how this shows the difficult decision ransomware victims face, should they pay the ransom or not. The U.S. government has a position on this. Both CISA at the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI strongly recommend organizations do not pay ransoms. Why? Because paying ransoms rewards ransomware hackers. If no one paid ransoms, criminals would have little incentive to engage in ransomware attacks. And even if an entity pays, there is no guarantee that the hackers will give them the decryption key or not strike again. And we'll talk more about that, too, in terms of this incident. However, organizations obviously have to weigh these consequences against keeping the operations offline, in this case, limiting 45% of the East Coast fuel supply. Colonial Pipeline paid DarkSide a ransom, we're told, of 75 bitcoins worth over $4 million at the time. Yesterday, the good news is the Department of Justice announced the recovery of 63.7 of those bitcoins. But DOJ won't be able to recover those ransom payments in other cases. So we'll talk more about that and how they did it and what that means. I appreciate Mr. Blount's transparency in acknowledging that his company paid the $4.4 million in ransom. I hope today we can explore the reasons for that decision. Third, this attack demonstrates the gaps in information sharing between these impacted organizations and the federal government. Last month, Brandon Wales was before us in that very seat. He's the acting director of CISA. He testified in response to one of my questions that he didn't think Colonial Pipeline would have contacted CISA at all if the FBI didn't bring it to them. CISA's authorities allow the agency to engage on a voluntary basis when requested by an affected organization. And CISA has the federal government's best practices is how to deal with these cyber attacks, and it was set up at Department of Homeland Security for that purpose. Well, I think that CISA being able to engage is the right approach. They must have relevant information to be able to share it among other critical infrastructure owners and operators who may be similarly targeted. So we've got to get them that information. There's a gap now. Finally, we've got to recognize these ransomware attacks for what they are. It's a serious national security threat. Attacks against critical infrastructure are not just attacks on companies. They are attacks on our country itself. When DarkSide attacked Colonial Pipeline, it wasn't just the company that was affected. Americans across the East Coast felt the squeeze of fuel pumps when Colonial shut off nearly 50% of the fuel supply. The criminals conducting these attacks often operate with at least a tacit acceptance and approval of the foreign governments they operate out of. The U.S. government needs to take stronger steps to hold these countries, like Russia, accountable. At the upcoming summit, President Putin and President Biden, one would hope that this is going to be at the top of the agenda. Ransomware attacks will continue to plague U.S. companies and critical infrastructure. As the Committee of Jurisdiction over both cybersecurity and critical infrastructure security, we need to reevaluate how we defend against ransomware and identify solutions to mitigate the consequences of these attacks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman. Mr. Blount, it is the practice of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you will stand and raise your right hand, please. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Joseph Blount is the President and CEO of Colonial Pipeline. He joined Colonial in October of 2017 with more than 3 decades of experience in the energy industry. Mr. Blount previously served as CEO of Century Midstream LLC, a company in which he co-founded. Mr. Blount has also spent 10 years with Unocal Corporation and ultimately served as President and Chief Operating Officer of Unocal Midstream and Trade. Mr. Blount, welcome to the committee. We look forward to your testimony and appreciate your willingness to answer our questions. You're recognized for your 7-minute opening statement.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee, my name is Joe Blount, and since 2017, I have served as the President and CEO of Colonial Pipeline Company. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee today. Since 1962, we have been shipping and transporting refined products to market. Our pipeline system spans over 5,500 miles and is one of the most complex pieces of energy infrastructure in America, if not the world. On any given day, we transport more than 100 million gallons of gasoline, diesels, jet fuel, and other refined products. Shipping that product safely and securely is what we do. The product we transport accounts for nearly half the fuel consumed on the East Coast, providing energy for more than 50 million Americans. Americans rely on us to get fuel to the pump, but so do cities and local governments. We supply fuel for critical operations, such as airports, ambulances, and first responders. The safety and security of our pipeline system is something we take very seriously, and we always operate with the interests of our customers, shippers, and country first in mind. Just 1 month ago, we were the victims of a ransomware attack by a cyber criminal group, and that attack encrypted our IT systems. Although the investigation is still ongoing, and we believe the attacker exploited the legacy VPN profile that was not intended to be in use, DarkSide demanded a financial payment in exchange for a key to unlock the impacted systems. We had cyber defenses in place, but the unfortunate reality is that those defenses were compromised. The attack forced us to make difficult choices in real time that no company ever wants to face. But I am proud of the way our people reacted quickly to isolate and contain the attack so that we could get the pipeline back up and running safely. I am also very grateful for the immediate and sustained support of law enforcement and federal authorities, including the White House. We reached out to federal authorities within hours of the attack, and they have continued to be true allies as we've worked to quickly and safely restore our operations. I especially want to thank the Department of Justice and the FBI for their leadership and the progress they announced earlier this week. I also want to express my gratitude to the employees of Colonial Pipeline and the American people for your actions and support as we responded to the attack and dealt with the disruption that it caused. We are deeply sorry for the impact that this attack had. But we are also heartened by the resilience of our country and of our company. Finally, I want to address 2 additional issues that I know are on your minds, and I'm going to address them the only way I know how, directly and honestly. First, the ransom payment. I made the decision to pay, and I made the decision to keep the information about the payment as confidential as possible. It was the hardest decision I've made in my 39 years in the energy industry, and I know how critical our pipeline is to the country, and I put the interests of the country first. I kept the information closely held because we were concerned about operational safety and security, and we wanted to stay focused on getting the pipeline back up and running. I believe with all my heart it was the right choice to make, but I want to respect those who see this issue differently. I also now state publicly that we quietly and quickly worked with the law enforcement in this matter from the start, which may have helped lead to the substantial recovery of funds announced by the DOJ this week. Second, we are further hardening our cyber defenses. We have rebuilt and restored our critical IT systems and are continuing to enhance our safeguards. But we are not where I want us to be. If our CIO needs resources, she will get them. We have also brought in several of the world's leading experts to help us fully understand what happened and how we can continue, in partnership with you, to add defenses and resiliency to our networks. I especially want to thank Mandiant, Dragos, and Black Hills on the consultant side, in the White House, and all the government agencies who assisted us both with the criminal investigation and with the restart of the pipeline. We are already working to implement the recent guidance and directives on cybersecurity. Our forensic work continues, and we will learn more in the months ahead. I appreciate your support and look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Blount. Mr. Blount, Colonial is one of hundreds of victims of ransomware attacks against our nation's critical infrastructure of this year. Would you think, and would you agree with the statement that the federal government should be doing more to help companies like yours prevent cyber attacks?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to state that as a private entity, we know we have a responsibility as well. Right? We're accountable for our defenses in our reaction to attacks like this. But I think if we look at the number of incidents that are taking place today throughout the world, let alone here in America, it's private industry alone can't do everything, can't solve the problem totally by themselves. So it's the partnership between private and government is very important to fight this ongoing slaught of cyber attacks around the world.
CISA is the main federal domestic cybersecurity agency, and it hosts the Pipeline Sector Coordinating Council to help bring together the private sector and government in that partnership, as you mentioned, to identify and address security issues. Do you know that if Colonial ever participated in these meetings or any other exercise or events that were hosted by CISA?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. I know that CISA is a good organization, and I know that we maintain a lot of communication and contact with CISA and have historically between our CIO and representatives from CISA. Actually, I was somewhat disappointed when I heard that they felt like if we hadn't gone in and contacted them the first day with the FBI, that we would not have contacted them separately. If you go back and look at the record and look at who we contacted throughout the event, we talked to every entity that could possibly help us get through the condition that we found ourselves in that day.
Do you know if you've participated in any of those meetings?
Yes, Senator. We participate in every governmental opportunity that we have to do tabletop exercises, security screens, and things like that.
So you mentioned you didn't contact CISA directly, so why did Colonial Pipeline decide to forego contacting or notifying CISA directly? What was the rationale for that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We contacted the FBI almost immediately that morning once we determined that we were under attack. In that conversation with the FBI that morning, they frankly said, we want to get on a phone call later today. We're going to bring CISA into the conversation. And so at that point, we already knew the contact would be made there. We had a lot of governmental entities to respond to that day and call directly, and that was the most efficient means. We knew they would be in that meeting, and they were indeed in that meeting right after noon the day of the 7th.
Well, as you mentioned in your opening comments, and you've reiterated here in answers to these questions, you've been working closely with the FBI, and I know you allowed Mandiant, the private security firm, which you also referenced in your opening, to share information with CISA, and that is happening now. But given those actions, I would suspect that you agree that you have a responsibility to protect other potential victims based on what you have learned. To what extent do you believe that responsibility extends?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. We've been very transparent from the start. If you looked at who we contacted that day, we started with the FBI. Obviously, they included in the follow-up conversation. And then we started marching through all the ones that we normally would report to, whether it's the FERC, PHMSA, DOE, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found during that day was that we were allowed the conduit through DOE to talk to all these organizations on an ongoing basis, but through one central briefing. So we found that the ability to have that conduit to work on the supply side of the equation and on the restoration side of the equation with any number of government restoration and on the supply side was extremely helpful to Colonial Pipeline and our employees. It was an all hands on deck situation that morning and throughout the event.
And prior to the attack, I assume, I know you're not a technical expert, but it would have been helpful for you to get information about other potential attacks or other companies that may have been attacked with similar types of cyber incidents?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. For example, we gave a lot of indications of compromise to the FBI and CISA during the days of the event. And I think what we saw is, as an industry, is immediately that material was dispersed out. And in the case of the IP addresses, I believe CISA actually posted those. And that was a means for us, once again, to efficiently communicate to our industry partners what was going on. And in addition to that, we go back to the first day when we were contacting people, we made initial contact with some of our industry trade groups to tell them what we could possibly tell them at that point in time. So we've been, once again, very open and transparent, hoping that everybody could not only be aware of the situation, but think about what they could do to help prevent that from occurring in their own company.
Well, that's all very encouraging to hear. And just for the record, I'm working on legislation right now to make sure that information is indeed being shared with CISA to get a better understanding of what's happening in ransomware, not just with your company, but across the board. Reporting indicates, and you've affirmed today, that you made the decision to pay the ransom of $4.4 million. We're certainly happy to see that a portion of that's being recovered by the Department of Justice now. My question to you, though, is prior to making the decision to pay the ransom, had you consulted with anyone in the federal government on whether that would be an appropriate response?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. It was our understanding that the decision was solely ours as a private company to make the decision about whether to pay. And considering the consequences of potentially not bringing the pipeline back on as quickly as I possibly could, I chose the option to make the ransom payment in order to get all the tools necessary and the optionality of those tools to bring the pipeline on as quick as we possibly could, safely as well as securely.
Well, after you paid the ransom and received the key to unlock your systems, did that actually fix all of the problems? Where are you today, and how long do you think it'll take for you to be 100%?
That's a great question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for asking it. I think what a lot of people don't realize about cyber attacks and the repercussions of a cyber attack is it takes months and months and months, and in some cases what we've heard from other companies that have been impacted, years to restore your systems. Our focus that first week was to restore the critical systems that we needed on the IT side in order to safely and securely bring our pipeline system back up. So that's what we focused on. You know, an example would be this week we're bringing back online 7 finance systems that we haven't had since the morning of May 7th. So again, the remediation is ongoing. And again, that's why you bring someone like Amanda in immediately, one, to help investigate the situation, but also to help restore what you've lost throughout the process. The keys are helpful, and we have used the keys, so they have been advantageous to us, but they're not perfect.
And I think that's important to remember. You get the keys, but you still have a problem for many months and a lot of work to do.
Yes, sir. That's
Really
correct.
illustrates the seriousness of what we're dealing with. Thank you for your answers. Ranking Member Portman, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Blount, you're a victim, and we understand that. And yet, we're trying to provide oversight and even provide some new laws potentially to try to deal with this increasing and really dramatic issue of cyber attacks, and specifically today talking about ransomware. Let's just clarify the record. You made your ransomware payment to the hackers on the day you discovered it. Is that correct?
Ranking Member, thank you for that question. We did not. We made the decision that evening to negotiate with.
So that was the evening of May 7th?
Yes, sir.
And so you didn't make the payment until when?
The payment was made the following day.
May 8th?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you indicated today that the FBI was in discussions with you on May 7th. Is that correct?
Ranking Member Portman, that's correct. Yes, sir.
And what did the FBI tell you? What did they advise you to do with regard to paying the ransom?
Ranking Member Portman, I believe I was not involved in those conversations with the FBI, but in discussions with my team, I don't believe the discussion about the ransom actually took place the first day on May 7th. The focus more was on getting to the proper centers of expertise with the FBI, and in this case, I believe it was the San Francisco office. We started with the Atlanta office in our notification. And then it was a function of they already started to collect data from us, indications of compromise and things.
So their official position is you shouldn't pay ransoms, and yet they didn't communicate that to you as far as you know.
Ranking Member Portman, of course, I was not in that conversation. I can't confirm or deny that, but I do agree that their position is they don't encourage the payment of ransom. It is a company decision to make.
Yeah, and so you knew what their advice was going to be even if they didn't provide it that day.
Ranking Member Portman, yes, sir, we did.
Okay. Did you talk to the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control? This is the office that's charged with sanctions. And so if you're a sanctioned individual and you make a payment, as you know, there are potential violations of law. Did you contact Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control?
Ranking Member Portman, that day that we decided to negotiate, we hired experts both on the legal side as well as on the negotiation side. We didn't have any direct contact with DarkSide ourselves, and I can assure you that everyone involved in that process continually went and back-checked to make sure that this was not an OFAC-listed entity.
So you were in touch with OFAC to ensure you weren't paying the ransom to a sanctioned entity or to a sanctioned individual?
Ranking Member Portman, I was not involved in those conversations, and so I can't attest to who actually talked to who, but I do know that repeatedly throughout the process, the fact of whether DarkSide was on the sanctions list or not was fact-checked repeatedly.
Okay, we may have some follow-up questions on that just to figure out what the relationship was there. And again, this is about looking forward. How do we avoid the situation where sanctioned individuals or entities are getting a ransom payment, which would be a violation of federal law? The Wall Street Journal says that the decryption tool didn't really work. So you paid the ransom, they give you the decryption tool to be able to undo the harm that they did. That's how it normally works. And yet the decryption tool was not effective. Is that correct?
Ranking Member Portman, the encryption tool is an option that's made available to you. So, and when you're looking at bringing critical structure back up as quickly as you possibly can, you want to make every option available to you that you can. Mandy, it can be the best one to answer about how important the encryption tool was, restoring the critical options we needed within the first couple days.
But did the decryption tool work?
It has worked, yes, sir.
So Wall Street Journal story was inaccurate. It was effective.
Ranking Member Portman, I think that article came out pretty early on, so I would say that we know subsequently that the encryption tool actually does work to some degree. As I've stated earlier, it's not a perfect tool.
Okay. It was provided to you by the hackers, correct?
Ranking Member Portman, yes, sir, that's
Okay.
correct.
So there's also news reports about how this happened. As I said in my opening statement, there was a compromised password of a virtual private network or a VPN account. This account apparently did not use multi-factor authentication, which again is kind of just a basic cybersecurity hygiene item that companies should have in place, making it harder for people to gain access. Prior to the attack, did your company require all employees to use multi-factor authentication?
Ranking Member Porton, in the case of this particular legacy VPN, it did only have single-factor authentication. It was a complicated password, so I want to be clear on that. It was not a Colonial 123 type password. The investigation is ongoing by mandate to try to determine how that material was compromised. But in our normal operation, we use an RSA token allowance in order to create authentication difficulties for remote access.
So would your advice going forward be that multi-factor authentication ought to be used?
Ranking Member Porton, that's absolutely the correct advice.
So TSA has given industry a lot of leeway. Critical infrastructure and voluntary compliance has been the approach. They came out late last month after your attack with some new directives, and now there's a mandate that reporting cyber attacks must happen. They must go to CISA, which is, again, this group within the Department of Homeland Security, and then it will be shared with TSA. You've got a designated cybersecurity coordinator within the company, and you have to review your current activities against their recommendations on cyber risks, identify gaps, and develop remediation measures. Do you support that?
Ranking Member Portman, if you look at our actions starting on May 7th, we almost to the T duplicated what the new standards are, and we are in full compliance today as well.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that, we have written legislation in this committee over the years to try to deal with cybersecurity. Pretty much every member here today has been involved with that. And as I said earlier, we obviously need to do more. The question is, with regard to critical infrastructure in particular, should there be more mandates? And now there is, and they have the authority to do this under 2007 law, it appears. Now there is this mandate on reporting it, a mandate on having a coordinator. But still, there's not a mandate saying that you have to do certain things in terms of best practices or good cyber hygiene. Do you think there should be additional requirements from TSA with regard to critical infrastructure?
Ranking Member Portman, first I'd like to thank you for your leadership on these issues in the past, but certainly on a go-forward basis. I think anything that can help industry have better security practices, standards to follow, would be extremely helpful, especially for the smaller companies that are in other industries as well as my industry, less sophisticated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman. Senator Carper, you are recognized for your questions.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blount, thank you very much for joining us. We bet that you and your employees, your company, and those who've been certainly consumers by this, but we just started. We had to other parts and businesses, maybe give them 2 or 3 words of advice to help them with this sort of thing. What would you say?
Senator, that's a great question, and if I could boil it down to 2 or 3 words of advice, as you suggested, I would suggest that we certainly take a look at our defenses, and even though we felt comfortably historically that we're where we felt we needed to be to protect our assets, this threat grows every day. The sophistication of this threat grows every day. So let's make sure that we're keeping our eye on that. And then the other side of the equation is, if you wind up in a situation like we found ourselves on May 7th, have an emergency response process that allows you to respond quickly and, most importantly, to be extremely transparent and to contact the authorities who indeed do have resources that potentially could help you through a very, very difficult process.
Oh, Abraham Lincoln, what is the role of, he responded, government with spent a lot of time with respect to cyber. Role to review. This should be what.
Senator, thank you. I have a bit we can do things, assets and wise, but there are things to participate, and that's and where government comes into play. It's been regulated for over. Regulation is not, we think, be healthy. So we support anything that helps further protect these critical assets that we all rely on daily.
Blount, you, I'm sure that are specifically transportation administration, a federal program for pipeline securities, but TSA, most going through airport security, but they do a lot of other things. So for the most part, do them, I think, very well. But the TSA works closely with the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, as well as folks at the Department of Energy Regulatory Commission. That's just a handful of government agencies that are working to secure our nation's pipelines, and that type of coordination among agencies requires continued collaboration and communication. I've got a two-part question for you, if I could. First, how frequently are you or your counterparts or your team members, how frequently are you in contact with these government agencies I mentioned above? And secondly, how has interagency coordination among these agencies strengthened or weakened pipeline security?
Thank you for that question, Senator. We're in contact quite often with all the agencies that you mentioned. Again, as I noted, we are a regulated entity, and we know it's important to communicate what's going on across our pipeline system and with our operations, with all our governmental partners. And then there's a lot of entities within the government that don't regulate us, like CISA, up to May 7th, that we also have had constant communications going on. So I know from my CIO's perspective, she does spend a lot of time with CISA. She does spend a lot of time with the TSA, talking about what's going on in the cyberspace and defenses and things like that. And I'll go back to May 7th, and what I saw as being most helpful for an operator that's been, subject to an attack is, again, that was critical for us to be able to have that one central conduit in the government. And in this case, it was DOE, who allowed us to communicate everything that was going on at the time through one central conduit, although all the parties that you mentioned were sitting at that table, virtually, of course, because of COVID, hearing material real time that could help them go about doing their job, or potentially could go about helping the market resolve the issue that we saw. So we saw a lot of permitting changes, allowing truck drivers to drive longer hours, allowing trucks to carry more fuel. That was the kind of coordination that we got through that central conduit that the White House gave us. And again, I'm not saying one entity over the other. I'm saying that the combination of all of them through that central conduit was extremely valuable to our response, extremely valuable to the American public to get as much fuel back into the system as we possibly could, and whether that's through deviations in regulations or things that allowed us to bring our pipeline on much sooner than perhaps would have been.
Good. Maybe one other question. How quickly did your company reach out to the FBI?
Senator, great question. We reached out to the FBI within hours.
And what was the response?
The response, Senator, was we want to get you back on a phone call. We're going to bring CISA into the conversation, and we're going to start going through it. And I think part of that was we called the Atlanta office, and in this particular case, they felt it was dark side, and the FBI has an office specifically dedicated. They call it a Center of Excellence for dark side. So they're dark side experts, which are California-based. So again, as early as we called in the morning, I mean, I know the FBI probably responds regardless of the hour of the day. It was pretty early in California when we made our call to the Atlanta office. But great response on the part of the FBI.
Good. How about the response from CISA? That would be my last question. How about the response to CISA?
Senator, of course, I wasn't involved in those conversations, but what I saw as a result of CISA being involved in those conversations was the ability to take some of the forensic evidence that the FBI was comfortable seeing released to the public, wind up in citizen notifications that would then help light companies and certainly a lot of pipeline companies take a look at like IPS addresses and things like that we had shared during that phone call and get that out in memo form to other operators. So great sharing of information on the part of CISA.
Good. Thanks very much for joining us. Good luck.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start out by, again, emphasizing and pointing out that you were the victim of a crime. You're not the bad guy here, and I appreciate my colleagues. I pretty well acknowledge that as well, and I think that's been reflected in their line of questioning. I want to, because a lot of people can do Monday morning quarterbacking, and it's easy for federal agencies to say, no, don't pay ransoms because it just encourages more. But I just kind of want you to, for the record, lay out how much worse could have it been had you not made that very difficult decision to kind of bite the bullet so that you could get your pipelines back up and operational.
Senator, first, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for your question as well. That's an unknown we probably don't want to know, and it may be an unknown that we don't want to play out in a public forum. But if you start to look at the fact that it took us from Friday all the way to Wednesday afternoon the following, and we already started to see pandemonium going on in the markets, people doing unsafe things like filling garbage bags full of gasoline, or people fist fighting in line at the fuel pump. The concern would be what would happen if it had stretched on beyond that amount of time, right? What would happen at the airports where we supply a lot of jet fuel, let alone what might happen to the gas pump? My concern the first day was more to the first responders and the ambulances and the things that we count on in emergencies beyond our own current emergency. That was my concern that first day. So our focus and our team's focus, regardless of what type of threat we see, is to identify the threat, contain the threat, remediate, and restore. And that goes beyond just, an incident like that. That's about anything that we see as unsafe. And that's why the call that morning by that head controller, supervisor of the control room to shut the pipeline down was so critical.
Okay. Again, I think that's an appropriate response, and I'll leave it to people's imagination, but I want people thinking about that as well.
Yes, sir.
Cyber attacks are an ongoing problem. There's no easy solution. As you said in your testimony, the criminals are on the offense, and they have a huge advantage. And it doesn't take much in terms of vulnerability. No matter how strong your IT systems are, your cybersecurity systems are, they're vulnerabilities, and they get exploited, and these guys becoming more and more susceptible to this. In terms of government versus private sector, from my standpoint, I think CISA is very valuable from the standpoint of sharing information preemptively, trying to stop some of these things. We've heard in testimony 90% of these attacks can be prevented just by basic cyber hygiene. It certainly sounds like you had pretty sophisticated cyber hygiene, although obviously vulnerabilities. The federal government can hold nation states accountable that are allowing these cyber attackers to operate on their foreign soil. And then, of course, hold them accountable when something happens, but also help in recovery and law enforcement. I'm not convinced that federal government is going to be particularly effective at issuing standards and keeping them up to date. So I really look at the private sector being far more nimble at that. One of the processes I've proposed is using a private sector model like an ISO certification. I imagine you go through something, I did. You have 6-month surveillance audits. You tie that to insurance system as well, where your rates are based on how good you achieve the standards. That's a system that will be as nimble as the private sector can be, is up to date, be able to employ the absolute best cybersecurity experts, which is one of the problems with the government. Again, it's just a problem. Government can't pay to retain the absolute best talent across the board. I just kind of want your thoughts on that type of framework, public versus private.
Senator, thank you. And I think those are all very good thoughts. I think, again, we have an obligation as private entity to make sure that our systems are as capable as they possibly can be. And we have a responsibility to continue to look at those systems because, as we all know, the threat continues to evolve. The sophistication of the players continues to evolve. Their ability to compromise systems continually evolves. And I think in combination with the government, together combined, we have a much better ability as Americans to thwart the threat of cyber attacks. And I think that, again, we both have a responsibility. You shared the concept of private industry can't do things to foreign governments, can't put pressure on foreign government. That's extremely important here if we look at where these criminals are housed, right? That something needs to be done there. So again, I think that private-public partnership is very valuable, but we certainly know we have responsibilities and accountability as well.
Again, I'm concerned about the government's, capability of establishing the standards, and then, again, penalizing businesses for being victims of crime if you don't meet their probably in many cases out-of-date standards. So I proceed down that line with caution. Just real quick, were you a member of an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center for your industry?
Senator, I don't actually know the answer to that. If I can get back to you on
Okay, I'd appreciate that. And the final question I have is, in our briefing and news reports, it wasn't just the shutdown, the ransomware, but it was, prior to them shutting you down, they extracted all kinds of data that apparently they tend to reveal or not reveal. Can you just describe that, if possible? Because I'm intrigued is maybe the wrong word, but I thought that was quite interesting. And do you have any assurances? Did you get that data back? Was that part of the ransom deal that won't be disclosed? And can you kind of tell us what kind of data they're talking about? Why that even be valuable for them or hurtful for that to be disclosed?
Senator, very, very good question, very important question. As part of the ransomware note, they tell you that they've encrypted information, that they've exfiltrated information. So we knew that they had exfiltrated information. We work very closely with the FBI on that, and the FBI is probably the best entity to respond to that since they're still, investigating the situation and, getting closer apparently to, at least we hope, to the perpetrators themselves.
But would that be personal information from your employees that would be valuable, or just trade secrets? You're a public company, so the financial information is available. I'm just kind of wondering what threat that represents to your entity or to your employees.
Senator, what we know about that material right now is it was exfiltrated off the share drive, so it contains a lot of different type of material. The good news is it was retrieved very quickly. It was brought back in. And again, I think the FBI can talk a little bit more about that than I feel comfortable right now because of their investigation. Okay. But again, the fact that it was retrieved very quickly is helpful. We don't fully understand everything that's in it because of where it's been held since it was retrieved. But we have people obviously involved in the combined process who have been looking very closely at that data.
Okay, listen, I appreciate you coming in here and being as forthright as you've become, so thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Hassan, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Peters, and thank you, Ranking Member Portman, for this hearing today. And thank you, Mr. Blount, for being willing to come before the committee today. Cybersecurity is a collaborative effort, to be sure, and we need to work together to strengthen public and private cyber defenses. Mr. Blount, I was glad to see that U.S. authorities were able to deprive hackers of millions of dollars in expected ransom. However, I want to better understand your decision to pay the ransom, and I understand it was a difficult decision. As you've already discussed, the FBI and other federal agencies strongly discourage paying ransom because it incentivizes more people to become cyber criminals and to develop better ransomware tools. When you decided to pay the ransom, did you know how much of your network was affected at the time?
Thank you for that question, and good morning again.
Good morning.
No, we did not, and I think that's what a lot of people don't understand in these incidents, these attacks. It takes you days, basically, to see into your system that's been corrupted as to what you have, what's potentially been exfiltrated. In the case of Colonial, we had really good backups, is what I've been told by Mandiant, but it still took them days to get through those backups. So when we look at our response time and ability to bring the system back up, it was fairly good in reality. My concern was, you don't have that view at all for days. And when you have a critical asset like this,
Right.
you've got to focus on what is the best opportunity of options you have in front of you to take avail of. And in that case, it was to get the encryption tool and to get our information back.
Okay, so I wanted to follow up. You mentioned the federal agencies that you reached out to, but what, if any, outside of those agencies, non-federal entities, did you consult with? Were there private firms that you consulted with?
Yes, Senator, great question. Obviously, we talked to Mandiant.
Yeah.
We talked to Mandiant about that. We talked to our legal resources that have been involved in any number of cyber cases in the U.S. over the last couple of years, people that have had real-time experience with these criminals, as well as the specific science of cyber attacks and compromise. So yes, a lot of conversation went into that decision that I made.
Sure.
To negotiate.
Okay, and did you have a cybersecurity response plan in place prior to the attack? And if so, did it include any guidance about paying a ransom?
Senator, great question. What we have as a pipeline operator, and it would be not unique necessarily to us at Colonial, is we have an emergency response process.
Right.
And again, I've said earlier this morning, see the threat, contain the threat, remediate the threat, and restore. So in this case, you use the same process, but you use a different set of experts. So in this case, we reached out immediately to FBI because it was criminal.
Right.
We immediately reached out to legal resources that have dealt with this. We immediately reached out to Mandiant.
Right, but my question is, in your planning, did you have a plan for cybersecurity response that included guidance about ransomware?
Senator, specifically, no discussion about ransom and action to ransom.
And did your team do tabletop drills, for instance, to go through an actual simulated cyber attack before this happened?
Senator, yes, we do participate in those with various groups, as well as do them on our own at Colonial.
Okay. Some private sector companies can focus strictly on economics and perform traditional cost-benefit analyses without having to consider national security concerns. However, owners and operators of critical infrastructure, and I appreciate your comments this morning acknowledging that Colonial oversees critical infrastructure, that carries a heightened obligation and duty to be capable of delivering goods and services to citizens all, in this case, up and down the East Coast. Mr. Blount, Colonial Pipeline surely performed some number of cost-benefit analyses regarding the operation of its pipeline to determine how much to spend on pipeline hardware, personnel, and even cybersecurity. Did any of your analyses incorporate any public responsibility factors, such as the impact of a potential cyber attack on consumers or on the U.S. economy?
Senator, that's a great question. I wouldn't say that we approached it that way. We know our number one goal at Colonial is to safely and securely operate that pipeline because we've known for 57 years the importance of that pipeline to the well-being of the American citizen. So that's always been our focus. Our investment, whether it's in pipeline integrity,
right,
or whether it's in cyberware and IT, is all derived around keeping safe and protecting the asset because of what its main benefit is to the United States.
Okay, I understand that and I appreciate that answer, but as you've had conversations with other senators this morning, you've mentioned that you didn't have two-step authentication in place. You've mentioned a legacy VPN, which in my understanding means it was a pretty old VPN. So I don't think it's acceptable to understand the critical nature of your product, but then not really have the preparation and the system in place to protect it as if it's critical infrastructure. You really do have an obligation to U.S. communities that you serve and to consumers and to our national security. So I am concerned that it doesn't seem to have been a formal factor in your analysis of how much to strengthen your systems.
Senator, we take cybersecurity very seriously. I did reference earlier that the VPN was a legacy VPN.
Yep.
We could not see, and it did not show up in any pen testing. That's unfortunate. But again, The safety and security of the system is highly critical. We've never had our board deny us any funds associated with safety and security, whether it's on the IT side or the physical side of the pipe. If my CIO wants funds, she gets them.
Okay. I would just, and this is an issue that I think we're seeing across the board on cyber, we need to start imagining what can happen and respond accordingly as opposed to always be looking at what the last problem was, right? And really investing. And for critical infrastructure, I think it's absolutely important that we have standards that really make sure that companies are investing in the kind of infrastructure they need. I have another question. I am running out of time, so I'll submit it for the record, but I really would like to get your thoughts about what kind of information, public-private information sharing needs to happen between and among whom and at what level, because I think that's another important piece to this whole issue. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hassan, for your questions. The chair recognizes Senator Langford for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blount, thanks for being here. There is no CEO in America that wants to be sitting in the same chair you're sitting in right now. To be able to go through all this, you're a month past a major attack. Obviously, there's a lot of work that you're going through. Can I back up for Colonial? When is the last time the Colonial, that pipeline was down and not providing fuel to the East Coast?
Senator, that's a great question. That pipeline has never been down completely, with the exception of, and I learned that just this week, over the couple hours of Y2K, and we can all appreciate going back in time that we were all concerned about the clock back then. So, periodically from time to time, we'll have a portion of the system down during a hurricane event or something like that, but never the entire system at one time, and never for that, obviously, that duration of time.
I think we as Americans get so used to going to the gas pump and filling up with refined products. Every one of us has landed at Charlotte Airport, and Jet A has been added to our plane as we change planes there. We get so used to that, we lose track of some of these things. So I want to ask a couple of things here. You had to do a physical inspection and a cyber inspection of this pipeline, or just going through the digital portion of it? It also has to do some physical inspection as well.
Yeah, great question. So, in the early hours of May 7th, we didn't know exactly what we had. We had the ransomware, but again, we're always concerned about the security of the pipeline. And you may have read in the press, it's a factual statement, we drove over 29,000 miles of the pipeline. And again, remember, it's only a 5,500-mile pipeline. So we had constant ground surveillance. In addition, we also fly the pipeline. It's a PHMSA regulation that we fly the pipeline. We fly in excess of that regulation on a normal basis. And on top of that, even double up our efforts during this point in time. Again, we didn't know that it was just a cyber attack. We had to make sure that it wasn't potentially an attack on our physical structure as well.
So that was completed. There were no other physical damage that you could identify.
That is correct, Senator. We didn't see anything. We did keep an eye, obviously, on the pipeline, just so you're aware. We kept the pipeline under pressure, and that would allow us to bring the pipeline up much quicker. So we had people manually in the field looking at gauges, the old school way of watching pipeline pressures, to make sure that we were in compliance with all the regulations, regardless of the attack and what happened in the shutdown.
So I said to several people that I've talked to in the last month, when we saw suddenly gas lines appearing and a pipeline go down at this point, that everyone learned the importance of pipelines. If I rewind 2 months before that, all the conversation was about slowing down permitting new pipelines. Maybe we're not going to do pipelines at all, making it harder to be able to do maintenance on federal lands on pipelines. 2 months ago, the conversation was, well, maybe we need fewer pipelines, and maybe we need to make this harder to be able to develop new pipelines. Obviously, Keystone Pipeline was in the news to say we're just not going to do that at all. And so products coming out of Canada and out of Montana are just going to have to find trucks and trains to be able to get there. I'm not going to ask you this same question because that's not going to be fair to you, but I've told a lot of folks what we watched happen with a sudden shutdown of a pipeline is the ghost of Christmas future for the entire country if we don't continue to maintain our pipelines, increase capacity of pipelines, if we don't continue to expand and have a duplication of pipelines in spots to be able to make sure we have redundancy for this. Pipelines are essential to America, and the 2.5 million miles of pipelines that we have scattered around the country, we lose track of how incredibly important they are. So I'm grateful that your company's had such a good reputation. This is terrible to be a victim of a ransomware attack. And there's something that you have that every CEO in America would like to hear, and that is, what are the lessons learned on cyber issues that you've already identified? Obviously, your team's taken on. The number one's already come out looking for legacy entries into your system that don't have two-factor authentication on it. What else has been identified that you need to be able to take on to pass on to others?
Thank you for your question. Again, I think the most important thing is to not be complacent about what you have because of the pace of change on the outside from the criminal side. And then the secondary to that, but equally as important, is the ability to have an emergency response process in place. If we had not been trained for the last 57 years to respond to any threat, whatever that threat is, it's an extension cord on the ground that hasn't been taped down that someone might trip over and hurt themselves. If we hadn't been trained like that and our employees hadn't been trained by that, who knows how many days it potentially could have taken to bring the asset back online. We know the importance of the asset, and we're dedicated to the American public as a result of all the training and everything we've done through the years to make sure that we have the fuel that we need.
All right. Backing up systems, clearing unused accounts, guarding data in other ways. Are there other things that you would mention to say these are lessons that are going to be important for the future? That obviously there was a gap, a single area of single vulnerability. Other lessons you would mention?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think from a proactive standpoint, you've seen now where we brought Mandiant in to investigate as well as to restore and start to harden our systems. But we've talked a lot about standards in this room today. And so we've also brought Dragos in and Black Hills in, and people may ask, why is that overkill? And I would say, I don't think so, because what we want to make sure is we get the best out of each one of those experts. They all have a specific skill. Dragos very good at OT systems, right? We want to make sure that we have the best hardening and the best segmentation we can possibly have on our OT side. So I think, again, it's that investment in resources to get the best in class, because, again, even the best in class is still susceptible. And we've heard that from each one of those experts.
Right. So if this is not ransomware attack, this is actually somebody that's getting into the system. Have you been able to determine going through it whether they would be able to get to your operating system to be able to change pressure, to be able to change volume, to be able to change flow through the structure they actually came through?
Senator, that's a great question. Obviously, that factored in largely to my decision and the employee's decision to shut the pipeline down that day. We didn't know, and we probably didn't know the answer to that for days. The investigation's ongoing, but up to this point, Mandiant has not confirmed any evidence that they were in the OT system, and typically that's not what DarkSide does.
Right. Right. It's a different animal, but it's a vulnerability that sits out there for someone else that does mean to be able to do our nation harm, not just your company harm at this point. And if they're not just going out for money, but they're actually going out for physical damage. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being so frank in your testimony.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Rosen, you are now recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman. This hearing, of course, so timely, so important. And Mr. Blount, thank you so much for spending your time with us today to bring some clarity to these extremely important issues to our nation. Because, you know what, it's a challenge for business owners across a variety of industries to commit the resources necessary and critical to preventing and combating cyber threats. It requires a team of dedicated staff with cyber expertise and the technologies needed actually to defend against an attack. So, Mr. Blount, it would be helpful to understand the resources you have at Colonial Pipeline devoted to cybersecurity's technology personnel and trainings. And so can you tell us just a bit about your cyber guidelines and best practices your company follows? Do you collaborate with federal agencies like NIST, DOE, and CISA? If you don't, why not? And can just talk to your plans to either current collaboration or collaboration going forward if you plan to do that.
Thank you, Senator, for that very important question. We're a highly collaborative organization. We're a highly transparent organization. We spend a lot of time in Washington, at least up until COVID, and now we spend a lot of time on the phone and in Zoom calls with all our regulators, as well as other entities like CISA, like the DOE, and other people that we feel accountable to for what we do for the nation. So again, very communicative, very present in Washington with all the federal agencies that we have access to, and we certainly appreciate all the collaboration that we're able to do with them. From a Colonial perspective, we have over 100 people dedicated to IT. Our CIO, when she asks for funds related to anything associated with cyber, she gets it. Our board is highly supportive of anything that protects the pipeline and protects our data. So we've never had any issue from the standpoint of getting the funding that we need in order to protect the asset and to protect our information and to protect the American public.
Thank you. I want to kind of build on this a little bit, because according to recent news reports, you have discussed scheduling a voluntary cybersecurity review with TSA. A lot of people have touched on this, but that review never took place. And so how often does your company conduct internal cybersecurity reviews or self-assessments? You do this on a regular schedule? And what do you do with the results? Who do you share them with, or do you share them?
Senator, thank you for that question. With regard to the VADAR voluntary program that TSA has, I had also heard in the press that we had refused to participate in that, and that was quite a shock to me, and it was quite a shock to our CIO. We maintain a lot of conversation with the TSA, and specifically at the director of security level there. We have participated in a number of things with the TSA in the past, including physical screening of our facilities. We have actually had the head of TSA in our office meeting with me and my management team.
Do you do your own internal reviews? Do you share them with others? How do you do those on a regular basis? I guess that's also the point of my question as well.
Senator, we do participate in periodic penetration tests. We do auditing, outside auditing of our cyber procedures in our IT department. And like all audits, you expect you're going to find something with a pace of change outside from the threat, and you rank the things that come back, and then you go about the business of tackling those things that are deemed deficient or weak in order to improve your defenses. So yes, we do.
Well, I want to build on that, because you repeatedly said during this hearing that you weren't part of conversations in the wake of the cyber attack, including the discussion with the FBI about paying a ransom. In hindsight, if you're doing these analysis, you're ranking things, doing all this, what do you think you should have been part of those conversations?
Senator, that's a very good question. This was an all-hands-on-deck day and week. My responsibility that week was to communicate to my board, make sure that my team was communicating where they needed to communicate. I directly handled all the discussions at the DOE level, including the daily briefings that we did with the DOE. I participated in the briefing with the governor's offices throughout the states that were impacted. So while it would be nice to be involved in every conversation, the reality of it is I can't be every place at once, but it was well taken care of by any number of my management team members, the people that report directly to me.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit about my Cyber Sense Act, because we know, of course, cyber attacks, that's what's happened to you. So last Congress, I introduced the Cyber Sense Act as bipartisan legislation that would create a voluntary cyber sense program at the Department of Energy that's going to test the cybersecurity of products and technologies intended for use in our bulk power system. This bill also directs the Energy Secretary to consider incentives to encourage the use of analysis and testing results when designing products and technologies, although I think the incentive would actually be not to be hacked. But Mr. Blount, while the program in my bill would establish is solely for electric utilities, do you think a similar program for pipelines would be helpful for gas companies like yours across the board to collaborate and communicate and have some sense of what's going on in the industry?
Senator, thank you for that question. I think that's a great program for the electric utilities, and I think anything that would help our side of the business be more secure and less susceptible to any threats is a great idea.
Thank you. And I think the last question, I have about a minute left. I just want to ask a quick question about why Colonial Pipeline didn't notify CISA immediately following the ransomware attack. Mr. Wales told this committee there's a benefit when CISA is brought in quickly because of the information we glean. We work to share it in a broader fashion to protect other critical infrastructure. So what's your response to Mr. Wales' statement and you not sharing your ransom cyberware attack?
I'm glad you asked that question, Senator. One of the first phone calls we made that morning within hours of noticing the compromise was to the FBI office. And during that conversation with the FBI said, we will call you back later. We want to bring in our Center of Excellence from California into the conversation, and we will call CISA and bring them into the conversation. So at that point, based upon the number of phone calls that we had to make that day to any number of governmental entities, we knew that CISA would be notified and brought into the conversation. We had a conversation with CISA the first day as a result of that connection with the FBI. If the FBI had not called them, we would have. We called every other governmental agency we were required to, and then some that day. So again, I don't know why he made that statement, but I can tell you we would have called him. There's no reason not to. We were extremely transparent, and we wanted all the help that we could get that morning.
Thank you very much for your testimony today. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Hawley, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Blount, for being here. I think you mentioned this in your written testimony, but I'd just like to start here. What percentage approximately of all fuel on the East Coast of the United States is transported by your company's pipeline?
Thank you for that question, Senator. It's approximately 45%.
And how many gallons of fuel does your company's pipeline transport on a daily basis?
Normally, we would move approximately 100 million gallons of fuel a day, Senator.
Yeah, that's a lot. Is it fair to say that tens of millions of Americans don't really have any choice but to rely on your pipeline for fuel? I mean, you have enormous market power is what I'm driving at. Is that a fair statement?
Senator, over time, we've evolved as a big player in the fuel business, and it's because of our reliability record. And quite frankly, we're the cheapest cost of transportation for the fuel to those customers.
Yeah. I think your pipeline, I think that the amount of fuel running through the pipeline exceeds the fuel consumption of Germany. And if I'm not mistaken, the closure of your pipeline facilitated nearly or led to nearly 16,000 gas stations without fuel across the country, which is huge. I mean, you're huge, and consumers really rely on you, is my point. I'm curious as to, given your market power, given the reliance of consumers, given the sheer number of consumers you serve, why didn't you take up the Transportation Security Administration's offer to do a comprehensive cybersecurity review of the pipeline?
Senator, thank you for asking that question. We indeed were in contact with them about setting that up. Obviously, COVID got in the way in the early days of that. We were getting ready to move at the end of the year into a new facility. So I think the conversation was that we want to do it. The VADAR program is a good program, but we will schedule that later on. We do have that scheduled at the end of July.
So it was a COVID issue, basically, or it was a moving issue? You're moving to a new headquarters. I'm looking at the Washington Post article here that reports that the TSA had tried to schedule a voluntary in-depth cybersecurity review, but that Colonial just couldn't get it done. I mean, do you regret not doing that in retrospect?
Senator, anything that you could do is always helpful. If we look at that test, it's a great test, but it's not dissimilar to a lot of the tests that we already do in our system. Again, we have a good working relationship with TSA. A little surprised by the statement that I heard about refusal. Actually investigated it on my end from my CIO and their contacts on TSA side. No one really understood why the word refuse was used.
So just let me understand your last statement. Are you saying you think that the TSA review would have been redundant, not particularly helpful? You said it's duplicative of things you do on your own end internally.
Senator, I think in this case it probably would not have resulted in finding that legacy VPN. Again, they don't actually go into the system. It's a questionnaire format type thing. I'm not saying it wouldn't be valuable. It very much could be. I think each one of these tests are slightly different. So if there's just that one little piece that can make the difference in seeing something, that's helpful. Again, never any issue with us actually getting to the point of doing that. It was a timing issue on it.
I got you. Who owns Colonial Pipeline?
Colonial Pipeline is owned by several entities.
Including
a division of Shell, Midstream, actually, Cas du Quebec, KKR, IFM, and Koch Industries.
Got it. I'm asking that because it's been reported that over the last decade, Colonial has distributed, I'm looking at the article here from Bloomberg, Colonial has distributed almost all of your profits, sometimes more actually, in the form of dividends to your investors. In 2018, for instance, Colonial Pipeline paid $670 million to its owners, which actually exceeded your net income for that year. I mean, that's a pretty good return. What do you invest in cybersecurity every year?
It's a great question, Senator. We invest over $200 million over the last 5 years in our IT systems.
And that's cybersecurity? How about on an annual basis for cybersecurity? $670 million distributed in dividends in 2018 alone. Give me a sense of, you're operating not unlike a public utility, right? I mean, we covered the fact you serve 45-50% of customers on the East Coast. You transport 100 million gallons a day. You shut down. The attack on you led to 16,000 gas stations being shut down. So just give me a sense of, given the importance of your company, the size of it, the reliance, what are you doing in terms of your investment for cybersecurity? I know you're paying your investors well.
Yeah, Senator, great question. Our dividend policy is not much different than any other midstream company. So I want to state that first. Our owners have never denied us any opportunity to spend what we need to spend in order to keep the pipeline safe and secure.
Which is about what a year?
Take the average, over $200 million in the last 5 years.
Okay, I tell you what.
Over $1.5 billion in system integrity every 5 years.
Got it. I tell you, we'll give you this as a question for the record so that we can get the actual, I know you don't have the number right in front of you, but we'll give you the question for the record and you can give us the exact number on an annual basis. I think that would be interesting to know. You talk about federal regulations in your testimony, and you said Congress should consider designating an official point of contact at a federal agency to better facilitate communication. It's an interesting idea. What rules do you think Congress ought to consider requiring of you and your company? I mean, so that's about your suggestions about what the federal government should do of itself. But given, again, your status, given the reliance on you, what do you think Congress ought to require of your company and companies like it going forward?
Senator, great question. I think what Congress should require is that we have a focus on safety and security of this critical asset, and I think we've demonstrated that over the last 57 years of responsible ownership and operations.
Let me ask you a little bit about the attack in the IT system. So I understand that the attack occurred or was first detected only in the IT network, not in the OT network. Is that right? Do I have that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
Okay.
That's what the investigation shows up to this point.
Got it. Okay. So to your knowledge, the OT network, the operational technology network, would not have been compromised by the attack if you hadn't have shut down. You shut that down as a safe precaution, security measure.
Senator, if there was 1% chance that OT system was compromised, it was worth shutting the pipeline system down.
Got it. I'm just trying to establish that, to your knowledge, at this time, you think it was concentrated in the IT system.
Senator, based upon the investigation by me to this point, that would be a correct statement.
Yeah. Okay. So here, this leads me to ask this. I mean, the pipeline is 70 years old, right? Roughly. There was a time, I assume, you correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a time, I assume, where you operated the pipeline without today's computer systems. What I'm driving towards here is, do you have the capability to manually operate the pipeline in the future, in the event of an IT attack like this one? And if you don't have that capability, should you, do you think, going forward?
Senator, that's a great question. We actually did operate small portions of the pipeline manually in order to alleviate some of the fuel shortage. And the discussion took place with the operations team about the ability to do that system-wide. And the response to that was it would be quicker to get back up on our feet by correcting the corruption of the critical IT systems that we needed in order to get the pipeline system up than to operate it manually. But I think on a go-forward basis, there's no question that we will look at that capability. And it's a really interesting question because if you look at the aging workforce now, a lot of those people that did operate Colonial Pipeline and other infrastructure in America historically manually, they're retiring or they're gone. Fortunately, we still have that last bit of that generation, which allowed us to do what we did during this particular event. It's a great question.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Ossoff, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you as well to Ranking Member Portman. Mr. Blount, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your candid testimony. I want to express my appreciation to your team based in Georgia for their diligent efforts to restore service swiftly and offer you the opportunity before the committee now to state any lessons learned as well as reflections on potential improvements to federal policy that we haven't had a chance yet to explore on the record. And I also want to thank you for your team's continual updates of my team as you sought to restore service, as you've investigated the nature of the threat, and for the conversation that you and I have had about the matter as well. But lessons learned, recommendations for Congress.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Thank you for your kind words, too. Yeah, I think there are several really important lessons learned. I think, the most important lesson learned is to respond immediately, right? And we've talked about stop work authority at Colonial, the ability to identify the threat, contain the threat, remediate the threat, and restart the system. And again, that goes towards any type of threat that we see, and not just particularly a cyber threat. So I think that's an important thing for any operator to remember is contain that threat. The other side that I'd like to share with you that I think is extremely important is communication. And there's been a lot of conversation in this room about who did you talk to and who did you communicate and at what time did you do that. And again, I will stress again, I think that what we learned was that being transparent and responding quickly and not being afraid to come forward was probably one of the most important things that we did in this particular case, not foreign to us, but perhaps foreign to others. And finally, I would add, I think the ability to communicate with the federal government through one conduit, regardless of who it is, was extremely valuable to us because, again, as I looked at this all-hands-on-deck effort that we had to do, the ability to communicate everything that we were seeing, whether it was the market response or the things that we were trying to get done on the IT side to do the restart, all the way to the investigative side of the equation, extremely helpful for a management team already stretched to be able to communicate quickly and efficiently and then allow our government partners to do what they could do to help us, which indeed they did. They were very helpful in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Blount. As you and I discussed last week, your team, I believe in collaboration with Mandiant, is conducting a comprehensive review of the threat, the nature of the attack, what might have been done to mitigate the risk, the efforts to thwart the attack once it was discovered. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator, that's correct.
And what impediment would there be, if any, to sharing the results of that review and the conclusions of that investigation, including at the technical level, with this committee once it's completed?
Senator, I don't think there's any issues with that. What we've been trying to do all along the way is share the information as we learn it. We've been very straightforward about the legacy VPN. Hopefully that will help out other operators who have similar type legacy assets. We know from working with Mandiant that's not an unusual issue for companies. So again, I think we'll continue to communicate as we go through the process with Mandiant, but our ability and desire to sit down with you is ready and available when you would like that.
Great. So we can expect that once that review and investigation are complete, that you'd voluntarily share with this committee the results of Mandiant's investigation.
Yes, Senator, we'll be very transparent.
Appreciate that. When you and I spoke last week, I believe you stated that you had not refused any requests for information from the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, or other federal entities. You've discussed the importance of the free flow of information between the target of an attack like this and the federal government. Having now had the experience of your company being subjected to an attack such as this and the communication that you had to engage in swiftly with federal entities, what do you think can be done to improve and make more efficient and direct the flow of information between the victim of a cyber attack and federal law enforcement, federal cybersecurity authorities? And I want to drill down a little bit on the following. You and I also discussed last week that the criminal enforcement side of the investigation and the cybersecurity side of the investigation overlap but are also distinct. Have you found any difference in the quality of the federal response, the nature of your communication with federal authorities between the criminal prosecutorial investigation and the cybersecurity investigation?
Senator, from my perspective, I would say the answer is no. And again, as we discussed, we had FBI, CISA, and of course Mandiant helping in the process, right? And we told Mandiant from the very beginning, if the FBI had questions or CISA had questions, please share information with them. And then, of course, as structured by the White House, we had the ability to communicate with everybody else on the restoration side and on the supply concern side through the DOE. And again, that worked wonderfully for us. Again, our time was stretched during the day when we were trying to respond to the situation and get things remediated so that we could bring the pipeline back up. So from my perspective as the CEO, to sit down at least at 5 o'clock every day, and sometimes more often phone calls would come, but at least have the ability to communicate the restoration side, what we were doing to restore the IT systems, share market market intelligence, because we have a unique perspective as Colonial as well. That was very helpful. So regardless of who that conduit is, the ability to communicate on the investigative side with all those parties at once, and on the restoration and the market side, extremely valuable to us. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on as you head towards bringing an asset like this back up, and you've got a lot of people that want to know a lot of things, and you don't have all the answers yet. But what I found is by having them all in the same room, the expert on this one particular area would say they wouldn't know that yet, and that would alleviate a lot of concern that the less knowledgeable person might have, even though they were very strong in what their particular discipline or science was.
Thank you, Mr. Blount. And finally, circling back to the ongoing Mandiant investigation, can you commit that the product that you share with this committee of that investigation will be the same product that you and your executive team and your board review, and that it won't be a different set of conclusions that are produced for the consumption of Congress, but it'll be the same assessment that you receive?
Senators, as I stated previously, we will be very transparent. I think the one thing that we need to be careful about as a nation is how do we share that information? Obviously, it would be very difficult in a public forum like this, because a lot of what we'll share about our strengthening and a hardening of our systems will be critical to keeping those strong and defensive against attacks. But yes, we need to talk and figure out what's the best way to talk about what happened, as well as what best practice on a go-forward basis is for an operator like ours that operates such sensitive infrastructure.
So recognizing that some of those conclusions, information, and plans may be sensitive and confidential, nevertheless, the appropriate forum for those confidences being provided will be able to exchange that information freely and review in full the Mandiant report?
Senator would gladly cooperate with you.
Thank you, Mr. Blount, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Well, Mr. Blount, I would like to thank you for joining us here this morning on this incredibly important matter. You know, we are clearly experiencing relentless and unprecedented assaults against both our private and public sector information systems, and we're getting those assaults by both criminal organizations as well as foreign adversaries, and this is a grave national security concern. And certainly from the questions that were posed today by all of my colleagues, I think it's clear that my colleagues believe this is something that we need to address immediately and in a comprehensive fashion. It's clear to me that the cyber attack against Colonial highlights the need for increased cooperation and coordination between both the federal government and our critical infrastructure partners. We must ensure that the American people are capable of not only defending our critical infrastructure partners from attack, but also maintaining a secure information system environment to prevent those cyber attacks from occurring in the first place. The infrastructure that American lives depend on is increasingly connected to each other, and connected to the internet. This brings a whole new meaning to the phrase, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And these weak links can be hacked accounts, inadequate passwords, or unknown vulnerabilities to the system. More must be done in this space, and I'm committed to certainly focusing my attention. I think every member on this committee agrees that this committee will focus our collective attention and resources on dealing with this problem. Cyber attacks used to be merely an inconvenience. We now know that they're becoming attacks on our very way of life. Once again, thank you for appearing here today. I look forward to your continued engagement on this important issue. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until June 23rd at 5 p.m. for submission of statements and questions for the record. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned.